Hello, everyone. In today's video, we're going to go over how to combine and push invisible logic variables within Gavel. So I'm going to be using the example of this address where whenever you're building something, especially when it comes to addresses, for example, you want to be able to separate this information out when you first collect it. That's going to allow you to combine this however you want in the future through invisible logic. Now, the reason for this is sometimes we need these to be separated out in, let's say, a PDF that has a line just for the address line 1, the address line 2, the city, the state, the zip, and the country. And these all need to be separate pieces of information that are input into a particular place. But maybe in other sections, we want to combine these into a single variable that is an address block that includes all of this information. Now, in that scenario, we could put each of these different lines in a particular order, but it would be a more efficient way of doing it, especially if you are trying to use this in a particular Zap or another third-party information or platforms, to just push a single variable instead of having it be this kind of multiple variable push. So in that, we're going to do an example where we have this setup that gets pushed into a second workflow that has the full address just nicely and neatly laid out like this into the default value of a text area block. And what that would look like in an output document, for example, when you just have this single variable that gets pushed through. So this is all going to make a little bit more sense when we run through it together. So let's go ahead and go into my workflows since I've already created these, and I can show you how I've set them up, and then I'll give you some examples. So in this first workflow, so in this scenario, we have a workflow 1, which would be something like where we would collect this initial information from a client or end user. So let's say this is our client intake questionnaire. So we have that initial one where we collect the information separately, but on the back end of this, we're combining these variables using invisible logic. Then we're going to have a second workflow that uses this information in a very particular way, which is that we want it to be all pushed together into a single variable, which is what we've created in the back end of this one here. So it's a little bit easier to see this from a visual perspective. So I'm going to go into the back end of this push 1, this address push 1, where it's all separated out. So in this scenario, in this particular workflow, what I've done is I have created a separate line or block for each of these: address line 1, address line 2, city, state, zip, and country. I've made some required and some not required. I'm just going to make this city required, but we're making line 2 not required, because sometimes people have an apartment number and sometimes they don't. So on the front end of this looks like this, where we have an address line 1, address line 2, a city, a state, a zip, and a country. I usually like to make this state and the country a combo box because this allows for someone to put in their own, but I have the list that is the US ones here just in case. I also have it to where the country is like this as well, where I have my own list, and then I have it to where they can type in, which also allows them to search. So it looks and functions like a search bar. Now, what's happening on the back end of this is two things. One is an example I wanted to show you, which you can do to change how something outputs using invisible logic. So I'll show that with the example of changing District of Columbia to DC in certain circumstances. And then how to take that variable that you created in invisible logic and use that in another instance of invisible logic, which would be the address block with the country. Now, the reason I might do this is maybe I know that in the future, in different workflows and different output documents that I need to use, I will sometimes need to have this state or district fully written out, such as District of Columbia. But maybe in other circumstances, such as in an address block, I need it to just be DC rather than District of Columbia. Now, one way to go around this, having to use invisible logic for this reason, would be that you could use a CSV file where you have all of those different combinations and different abbreviations and different types of ways of using this particular word or state or district. However, it's a little bit harder to in Gavel use CSVs in different types of logic within your workflows, or to have them serve as a basis for different types of logic. So I tend to go more towards the idea that I can use a drop down or a combo box type of question, and then using that in things like invisible logic and to combine different things in different ways. So it just depends on what it is you're trying to do. I like to set things up to where I have the most options in the future by the way that I've set it up here at the beginning. So with that being said, the first instance of invisible logic we're going to create in this particular case is an address state with DC as a short version. So the way that I've set this up is to say, if the address state variable, so where it says state, address state, is District of Columbia, which is clearly a district rather than a state, but here in this case, we'll just go with it. We're going to say then this variable that I created, address state with DC short, is DC as text. So I just went in and I went to text and I said DC and add. So that's just saying that if they've chosen District of Columbia, then I want this variable to equal DC. Otherwise, if they've chosen something other than District of Columbia, so its address state is not District of Columbia, then I want address state W or with DC short variable to equal just the address state. So whatever else they chose, the variable of address state here. So I just clicked on this and I said add. Now, what this will do is it will make it to where anytime I use this variable instead of the state variable, then I'm going to have DC or District of Columbia turn into the shortened version DC. So that's helpful when I want to create an address block where instead of it saying Washington, comma, District of Columbia zip code, I can say Washington, DC zip code. So in this case, I've created a second page of invisible logic where this is going to be an address block with the country. So I'm just going to say address block with country, and it's a text variable. And I'm going to add some invisible logic that says, if address street 2, so this line 2, which had like an apartment number or suite number or unit number, if that's empty, then I want this variable that I've created, address block with country, to equal, and then I have address street 1, so that's this one that's collected here. Then I have a tab, or sorry, not a tab, but an enter, so our hard return. So you can go into text and say hard return and say add, and that's going to add in a line that is telling the system that we want the next line to be under this top line. So in this case, I have address street 1 and then a hard return, and then I have address city variable. So that's just this one collected here. And then I have my address state with DC short because this is an address block where I want it to output as Washington, DC rather than District of Columbia fully written out. So that is the variable that I'm going to choose from my variable list because I can see it here with state with DC short. I just click on that and add it here. Then I can do a comma and a space, then address, then a space, and then the address zip or postal code, and then a hard return to have the address country appear on the bottom line, as you can see in this example here. So I have the line 1, and then if there wasn't a line 2, then this would be taken out, and this would be pushed up to Washington, D.C., 12345, United States. Then I'm saying otherwise, though, if address street 2 is not empty, meaning it's something's in there, then I want this variable of address block with country to equal address street 1, address street 2, address city, comma, and space with the state with DC short, then a space, then the zipper postal code, then hard return in the country. So that's what is shown here, where you have line 1, line 2, state, city, zip, and the city, state, zip, and country. So now the reason why we would do it this way and what would happen is that after the person runs through this initial first workflow, let's say that it is your client intake questionnaire that includes a page where it asks for this address information. Then if you were going to use this internally with your team where you would have someone who's on your team pushing this manually from one workflow into another, for example, or if you're having this automatically filled out from a Zap where you have one workflow completed once another one is already completed, then you would see that you'd be able to take this information and have it dropped or pushed into the second workflow, where the second workflow's variable in this case, so in this particular example where I have a text area question, where I have the full address, where in this case, obviously I'm just trying to show you one particular thing, but this would be one variable within, many other variables that are populating some document or fulfilling some other purpose. Then in this case, what I've done is I've taken the variable from my address one invisible logic that I did in the background. So we created that address block with country with all of that invisible logic attached to it. And I'm just using that one variable here to make it to where the default of this particular address when it's pushed is going to be the address from the session that we're pushing. So it's easier to see that if we have a little bit of an example. So if we go into our data manager, since I've already run this particular set of information through this particular workflow, if I go into by workflow and I select the test invisible logic address push test 1, then I can see these sessions as they've been run and who the user was. So in this case, I had a test where I did a pretend user. So let's say I take that person's session and I want to push that information into a second workflow, in this case, invisible logic address push 2. Then I'm just going to select that and push it. And then now I can see that this has already been pre-filled out with the information from the first workflow. So if I go into edit it, you'll see that this has already been laid out as I had directed it in the invisible logic. So that is how you're able to push that manually as a user of the Gavel platform internally. Now, let's say that you are a user who has been assigned this particular workflow, or they have this in a bundle, for example. If this person fills out this information, they'll be able to see their test invisible logic address push 1 and see their answers here. And because this information has all been collected, and because in our first workflow we had that invisible logic set up with that variable, that means that then when they actually go to take this second workflow, so let me just grab that from the workflow links here. I can grab that link, and let's say they're given this link, or like I said, it's in one of their bundles. As long as they're actually signed into their accounts here at the top right, then they're going to see that this is already pre-filled out for them because they've already answered these questions in the past in this first workflow. So that information is benefiting from data persistence because even though it's not an explicit question that looks exactly the same as this one here, it doesn't say full address and it's not a text area question when they first filled this out. It doesn't matter because the underlying information or variable that is at the base of this second workflow is an invisible logic variable that we created that has already existed underneath this push 1 test here. So with that being said, we've had it to where this information was actually created by invisible logic, combining all of the different variables in a particular format from this first workflow that we have now made it to where when we give this link to our client or end user, or we have this proceed in a particular flow within a bundle, for example, they're going to not have to manually fill this out, but could make any changes if their address has changed to make sure that the output document is populated correctly, which could look something like, in this particular example, this address block here. So this is just a very simple example to show you how you can move information from one workflow into another by combining invisible logic variables as well as regular variables in a particular format. Whether you're using this internally to push information from one workflow into another, or if you're having your clients fill this out, they'll still be able to benefit from this data persistence using the invisible logic variable you created rather than only being able to use the question type variables that you've created throughout the workflow separately. So I hope this was useful, and I'll see you in the next video.